Hello everyone, this is Matt, and today we're going to be just looking at the project, behind the scenes of this project that I just finished. As you can see on the screen right now, we are going to be looking at the beginning stages, simple shapes, the cup, the bread, the placeholder for the tenders, which is right there, a square, the box itself, the chips, the ketchup packet, and the sauce. And so yeah, the original plan for this project was to document my process. A lot of people don't know the process when it comes to 3D and stuff. They would ask you questions and stuff, like getting certain things done, but sometimes they don't necessarily know the full process of what it is you do. So while I was eating some tenders, I was actually contemplating to do another project, and I thought about, doing a project with chicken tenders. It's actually kind of difficult to try to replicate 3D food in a sense, because food is appetizing and what's not. So I wanted to push myself as well. So Snowman, you asked me how would I go about actually creating labels for a product if you don't have the source files. Well, here's the process right now. You load up Affinity Designer or a Illustrator. Use the pen tool and you start tracing with the pen tool. I don't think there's any other way that you could go about doing it. Maybe you could take pictures and try to UV wrap them around the model, but I think that this is going to give you the best results. So I did that for all of the packaging, actually, for the cup, the box, the chip box itself as well. And I was just basically tracing over all of the defined details, some of the fonts also, because they were quite custom. Some of them I just find fonts that were close enough and I just placed them on. I was originally going to trace over a lot of more of these water droplets, but anybody got time for that? A few water droplets will be just fine for this project. I just scaled them and duplicated them a couple of times and placed them where I see fit. So here is me just looking at placing them at certain places and testing it on the actual cup to see how it looks, and it turned out pretty fine. As you can see, there's only just a few of them here anyways, so at that moment at least. So yeah, a lot of people, as I was talking about earlier, a lot of persons don't know about the process. So worst case scenario, you will have to do projects like this where the client may come to you and they don't have the labels, they don't have the logos in certain formats, and you may have to actually trace over everything, which is only going to influence the cost of a project. If the client produces you with the labels and certain content, then obviously the price of the project is going to be much cheaper. But if you have to trace over everything, then you have to model, then you have to texture, then you have to light, then you have to animate, then all of those are things and factors that's going to influence the price of a project. So in reality, a 3D project is never going to be a fixed price, really, because there's a lot of factors that influence the end results. There's a lot of factors that could cause the price to go up and to go down. And yeah, so this is just me just looking at the finished textures for the box and the cup, and it turned out pretty good. And here's the final overall Affinity Designer scene with the labels and what's not for the box, the cup, and the chips box as well. So this is just the complete package layout or package design, really. So it's just a matter of tracing over everything. It's a lot of work, but If you're trying to replicate a certain brand for a portfolio piece or something like that and you don't have access to the labels, then you're gonna have to do it. So here is kind of interesting. I actually used a rock scan, a 3D rock scan, and I retextured it to look like a chicken tender. So majority of it was just me using the material editor to make it look as close as possible to the actual chicken tender. I think for a first attempt I did pretty okay. There's always room for improvement. I'm always trying to improve because one of my things is to accomplish photorealistic stuff. I'm kind of obsessed with that, so I'm always looking at ways to try to improve my process and my skills, and this was definitely a project to do that as well. So here's I'm actually modeling the chicken packet, the ketchup packet, sorry. I'm actually it was just actually a cube that I modified to look like a ketchup packet in its simple form, and then I add some subdivisions to it, add a subsurface modifier to it as well, and then I add a displacement because when you really look at ketchup packets, they're not smooth. They have, you know, bumps and stuff in them because of the contents inside. So I try to replicate that as close as possible, and then I add them to a vertex group, and then I UV unwrapped it. Look at it again in the real world settings with the HDRI image, and again UV unwrapped it, saved it out, import it into it as in the Affinity Designer, copy the logo and place it over the UV coordinates and save it out as a PSD, imported it back into Blender and plugged it straight into the material. As you can see, I placed the logo on the wrong side of the UV, so it's just a matter of placing it over on the other side, and there you have it. So as you can see, everything is there. So now we transition to how I actually made the bread. I was actually utilizing a lot of different techniques in this case study. I mean, that's the reason for improving anyways, to use techniques that you are not accustomed using. Sculpting is one of them. I'm not really that great at sculpting, but I wanted to utilize it for this project as well. And that's another good reason to use and to do case studies, because it allows you to use tools that you're not accustomed using. You have freedom to do that. So it was just sculpting to make this look as close as a bun as possible, trying to get all of the little details, wrinkles into the bread as close as possible, and then I move on to making it look as close as a bun as possible as well. So I used the fall off node into a color ramp or a gradient ramp, and then I mix both the fall off with a noise texture to give the bread some more texture to it. And it's just a matter of playing around in the material editor to do that. So here we move on to fluid simulations, and this process took a while, about an hour and a half or so, and it's just a matter of tweaking the actual fluids to look the way that you want it to look. So if you remember, this was the splash that you would get from the image that I uploaded first, the Mobby drink. So I was actually trying to simulate a splash. So what I did was I created a cube, added rigid body texture, a rigid body whirl on it, to simulate actual geometry falling in the actual whirl and falling into water, and it was just basically looking for a splash. But it's just a matter of tweaking certain fluid settings, tweaking certain domain settings, And this process, like I said, took around an hour and a half to finally come to a result that I preferred, you know. So again, all of these are things like if a client wants as a render with fluid simulations or physics simulations in them, that is also a factor that could increase the price of a project, because these things often take a lot of time to look right and to execute in a certain way. So here's the coming on to the end of where I actually, you know, like the actual result from the simulation. So it was just letting it bake in the bottom, and then from there I moved on to texturing the actual drink. So just use a specular with no roughness on it, and then I use a volume absorption into the medium, and remember I'm using Octane render, and that's to give the darker parts of the drink in the center to be darker, and the parts that are separating at the top that are closer, that have least amount of fluid, to be clear. That's how actual fluids or drinks behave in the real world. And here's just me setting up the scene, the cameras, the lighting and stuff for the actual shots that you saw on my page. So here was just adding some imperfections to the surface of the cup. In 3D world is actually, imperfection is actually perfection. You know, in the real world you actually want to have things as spotless as possible, but in 3D you actually want to make them to look as realistic as possible. So having some imperfections is actually good in this case. So here's the scene looking at the animation process. It's not going to be too much detail because again this was a lot of hours into this. To be quite honest with you, this was all of this footage together was 3 hours and 30 minutes that I just condensed into 20 minutes. So yeah, it was a lot of, and I couldn't record everything because this was about 11 gigs of recording data. So I couldn't record exactly everything. So here I just have the cup parented to an empty and the lights tracking at empty as well. So wherever the light goes, the empty goes, it tracks to the light. And I have the straw and the lid parented to another empty as well. So there's a lot of things to keep track in this animation. As you could see, I have 3 different cameras. At the bottom there's camera 1, camera 2 and camera 3, and when it gets to the next camera it switched, and that's because I placed a marker and then I bind the camera to the marker. That way it would be able to switch from one camera to the next while it was rendering. As you can see, I have dynamic paint set up on the drink itself, so that when the straw moves through the mesh, it actually looks like water is rippling. Obviously, those are details that you have to bear in mind when you're trying to go for photorealistic stuff. The drink was the canvas and the straw was the brush. A lot of the settings were simple, standard settings. So if you look at the cup itself, I utilized some geometry nodes in this. I just created some water drops and I scattered them on the surface of the cup itself to look like water droplets. So here you could see you could control as the amount of droplets you want, 0, or you could add as many as you want. So 60 something was correct for this scene. So again, this is the overall. This is the first scene where the cup flies into the air, or floats into the air I should say. This was the first scene, first shot, and I believe it was 4 seconds. So we're just gonna look at some of the details for the lid. The lid has some imperfection on it as well, some fingerprints and some smudges. And if you have a look at the materials that I use for that, you will see that I use a displacement texture for the words. I actually had to look online for a reference because I didn't have a reference of my own, so I looked online for a reference to see what the wording was on the lid, what it was, and it turns out it was diet, Coke, and other, and then international paper at the top. So I just again created a texture in Affinity Designer, UV unwrap the lid, and then I placed the texture on a gray image with a black text. And gray is just because it wouldn't move the displacement texture too high. As you know, displacement textures use either black, white, or gray. And as you can see, that's a UV layout. I just projected it from view. And then I exported the UV at 4K. And then I saved it. Open it in Affinity Designer, and then that was it. I just placed the textures on it, the words at least. So we're moving on to another scene. So this is the animation at the beginning, the last shot with the snap box itself. You can see that I kind of divided this up into 2 scenes. It was the scene transitioning from the cup floating into the air, and then it was this. So you can see there's 2 different settings here. I saved 2 different scenes, pretty much the same things but had different settings. And we're going to see that later on, because as you can see, it just turned off some of the collections that housed a lot of the geometry. So as you can see, this was the beginning shot. It would pan in. I'm just going to open in the first shot, set that back to 240. So if you look here, this is a transition from there to the first one. Again, a lot of these icons here you can see make it a lot confusing, but sometimes a lot of the things were just lights and the lines were just lights and what's not. So as you can see, the camera was parented to a curve, and that is the keyframes for the curve. It was scale, rotation, and location that I keyframed at different intervals to produce the camera result. The camera was actually parented to another empty, which is what I'm going to click on right now. And that also had its own animation keyframes, which was a constraint. So now we're going to look at some of the animation for some of these assets here, like the chips. I actually had those parented to and empty. And again, I had to reduce the number of chips in the box because it was getting animation problems. Certain chips were intersecting with one another and stuff like that, and this section for rendering was actually the slowest. Like certain frames would take like sometimes up to a minute and stuff to render, so I had to reduce some of the chips in here. So what I'm going to show you is something that I learned while I was rendering. While you have noise textures onto certain meshes, you need to make sure that you have a bait node into it, because it's going to cause ripple effects. The chicken skin actually, the texture on this chicken actually looked like if it was waves, and I couldn't figure out what was going on, and it only clicked to me afterwards, like the same day I was rendering out the finals, that you know what, I need to probably bake the texture. So I did that for both the sauce, the chicken, and the bread. I'm going to show you it here actually, because the bread didn't have the texture onto it. So all I did was create by clicking Shift A, created a bait texture, place that here, and then plug that into the texture, and that's it. That's what you need to do when you're animating in Octane with a noise texture. That's going to fix your issues. So again, looking at a lot of these keyframes, you can see it was a little bit confusing at certain points too, with a lot of the, because I animated them by hand. Here's the bones that I had parented. This is the first time I actually played around with armatures. So again, this was a learning curve for me as well. But I parented them to the box so that I could control the lid opening and closing. So it's always good to learn new stuff by doing certain projects and what's not. So you can see from the right hand side how it's going to move in the scene, and then the left hand side is showing you the camera. So here we're going to transition to the splash, the scene where the ice drops into the drink, which was the simulation that I spoke of before. So you look at this from front view, and we can see that the cup is actually vertical. It's just that I tilt the camera to a little bit to an angle. And if you look at the mesh, we could go to this layout that I created for Matterflow, which is the fluid simulation in Blender, and it's just a matter of playing around with the parameters like the domain, the flow object. You want to make sure that you set the object to reshapeable in Octane, because if you render the animation, it's actually not going to show up. So this is also another thing that I learned while I was working on this. You change the liquid to a flow object, and then you change the ice cube to movable. So when you're dealing with animations in Octane, you always want to make sure that you keep those settings in mind, because you would render one image and it works fine, and then when you try to render the animation, you realize that the asset is actually not rendering. So bear that in mind. So here is the animation with the water droplets, as I mentioned before. The splash. Again, this was another playing around with the parameters. I use 80. Make sure that I change the steps. I changed APC, PIC, and those were the settings that I used for the mesh output as well. And then it's just a matter of baking the texture from frame 40 to 120. So that cached out a lot of the data there as well. So I rendered at 120 frames because I wanted it to be in slow motion. That was also something I wanted to do. For this project at least. So yeah, that's about it pretty much. I just used some rigid body settings again to make sure that the ice cube didn't fall all the way through. Settings for this was 300 samples, and then enable adaptive sampling. I changed some of the settings a little bit, and then a lot of the other settings were in the imager. I left most of the other settings to be the same, but I actually used ASUS in this as well. First time using ASUS, just to figure out the workflow. And those are the parameters for the post-processing effects. So yeah, that brings it to the end of the behind the scenes. Hope you learn a lot. So see you next time.